Hello, I'm Morag, and welcome to this special episode of Sense Making in a Changing World podcast, a conversation from the 2024 International Permaculture Festival of Ideas. In this festival, I invited my friends and colleagues to join me in conversation, ideas sharing, music, film screening, poetry reading, and storytelling. I was joined by educators, Indigenous leaders, designers, artists, scientists, activists, scholars, practitioners, philosophers, writers, filmmakers, and musicians, exploring ways to broaden and deepen permaculture possibilities. There were 35 speakers at the live event across 8 days in May 2024, spanning 6 continents and over 2,500 registered people for these live events. What an extraordinary event, and I'm so honoured, delighted to be able to share these with you. In this episode, I'm joined by permaculture educator and filmmaker Andrew Millison. We talk about his latest series of epic permaculture films, and at the festival, we screen one together. You can find the link below to watch it. Andrew Millison is an agent for change who shares permaculture wisdom through expressions of art, design, and multimedia storytelling. He creates films of epic permaculture projects across the planet and shares them on his wildly popular YouTube channel. Some highlights are his series on India's water revolution, featuring some of the most impactful large-scale permaculture projects on the planet. Andrew is a speaker, designer, and educator, and as a member of the horticulture department, he's developed the permaculture program at Oregon State University. Before we head to the conversation, I'd first like to acknowledge that I'm recording this episode from my hand-built, solar-powered studio here in beautiful Gubbi Gubbi country with Jinnaburra lands to the east. I'm surrounded here by my permaculture forage gardens in a permaculture eco-village. This podcast is a project of the Permaculture Education Institute. We teach permaculture design, teaching, and livelihood skills online to people on 6 continents, who in turn localize and enrich it and find appropriate ways to apply the planet care ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share wherever they are. Check the links below to find out more about our programs. And remember to subscribe to Sense Making the Changing World on your favorite podcast app, to share it freely, and to leave us, please, a 5-star review and a lovely comment, because it really does indeed help people to find this podcast. Well, welcome, Andrew, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Morag. It's always a pleasure to talk to you here and talk to whoever's out there.
So I'm really excited that you're here with us today, because you've been out in the world exploring some quite, well, epic is the word that just keeps coming to mind, projects which maybe don't necessarily call themselves permaculture, but apply the permaculture principles at scales that are transformational. So where have you been recently? Before we screen one of your films, where have you been recently?
Yeah, most recently I was in southern Spain. I was visiting a few different projects. One of them was a regenerative seawater agriculture project. So I'm actually I'm in the middle of editing that video right now. So I'm sort of steeped in the salt water. And basically there's 2 billion acres of salt affected land on the planet, whether coastal marshes or places where the aquifers are only salt water, or places where land degradation has salinated the land. And there are some really brilliant people out there figuring out how to create agriculture with halophytes, plants that grow in salt water. So I visited that project in Spain, and I visited the ecosystem restoration Camp Altiplano, met up with John D. Liu there, and filmed that project. So that's my most recent trip. Yeah.
And the film that we're going to screen is from the project in the sort of the mid top part of Africa, where it's around Senegal, I believe, holding back the desert.
But the crazy thing about that project is that's a very small, young project compared to what the WFP, the World Food Program, has actually done throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And so right now I'm actually talking with the WFP to plan another trip to see their really big projects in Niger and Chad. And we do have some B-roll from the larger scale and more mature projects. Some of the questions that come up when people watch the video that you're about to watch the main questions I see in the comments of the video, people are like, oh, but when the WFP leaves, what's going to happen? It's just going to fall apart, right? Sort of critical nature. And so I would say that look carefully at some of the drone footage that I got from the WFP, and you'll see what these projects actually mature into. Because they have some of these projects similar to what you're going to see that are a decade old right now. Some of the other questions that come up are, why does an outside international organization need to come to these places at all? Why do these people need the WFP to come there? And so that's a question that I'd like to answer as well in the future, right? Because, obviously, there's been a lot of shattering that happened with colonialism and all the history of everything that's gone on. So, it's just something to keep in the back of your mind, that I will answer in a future video. But yeah, I've been astounded by the response to that video. It's sort of like magnitudes larger than anything else I ever did. And, just why did this video strike such a chord in people? My theory, aside from obviously having a really nice thumbnail image and a title, the title is how the UN is holding back the Sahara Desert, right? So I think that people in our beautiful vision of the world as it should be, the United Nations, an international body doing large scale land restoration, that's what they should be doing. So I feel like it taps into like an innate knowing that that's actually what we should be doing. That's that if we were going to have a UN, I mean, we have a UN, that is the kind of thing that a transnational, conglomeration of the nations of the world should be doing.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
There's been a lot of lost trust in the UN, and this kind of brings back that sense of feeling of what is possible.
The UN actually has a resilience program, and they have been working, especially this guy Voli, who's been the head of resilience for many years. They have been working a lot of work. I don't know if you ever saw John Delu's film in Ethiopia where they did the watershed restoration. I mean, that's the same people basically that have spearheaded this. So they've been restoring large scale landscapes, very under the radar, so to speak. The World Food Program is primarily delivering food aid. That's what they're doing mostly. But this program has been going, and the idea is to offset the amount of aid that they need to deliver. So they're actually showing that they're saving, tens of millions of dollars by making people food secure. And so that's, the direction that this is going. And Natalie Topa, who is part of the World Food Program now, she was my gateway into got my foot in the door, so to speak. There's one thing actually from a previous comment you made that I just wanted to say. Using indigenous technologies, I think one of the really interesting things about this project actually is also the inclusion of more, you might say, contemporary design, which is with its syntropic agriculture that's developed in Brazil, which is, you might say, a more contemporary agroforestry system. So I find it, as a permaculture person, I find it really fascinating to see these more modern, scientifically based ecological systems and how they merge with traditional indigenous technologies. And I mean, that is some of the most fascinating hybridization that I'm seeing around the world when you get that sort of effect.
Yeah, that was phenomenal. And really to see, your diagrams on the board really helped to bring that to life, to show that those states of like the process of regeneration, where it starts, where the water starts to sink in, and then below that having the syntropics, and then once it reestablishes to get to the next, like the succession planting that happens, and really how that whole system can come alive. And there have been questions actually during this festival about syntropics, and I wonder whether you could just speak a little bit more to where you've seen syntropics taking off in, the travels that you've been.
Yeah.
Where is it myceliating to?
I keep I never even knew about syntropic agriculture. I hadn't really heard of it. Maybe I'd heard the term, but I had no idea what it was until I was in the Chinampas of Mexico City. And the project there, Lucio Usobiaga, his Arcatera project, restoring the traditional chinampas, but they were doing syntropic agriculture on the chinampas. And so I was like, whoa, what? So he sort of gave me like explained to me what syntropic agriculture was, and then it just seems like everywhere I look into, there's syntropic agriculture. So there's syntropic agriculture in the WFP. There's syntropic agriculture when in southern Spain, there's syntropic agriculture. It seems like it's really oh, and then my colleagues in Kenya, right, with Forest Farms, they have a whole syntropic agriculture sort of business where they're really scaling up and working with clients to do large scale installation, design and installation there. So it's really interesting, and I actually want to know a lot more. Like I'm trying. At some point, I want to go to Brazil and really go to the roots, see some of the most mature. I don't know, Ernst Goetsch is. I've tried to get in touch with him, but he's not an easy guy to get in touch with. But he's the founder, you might say. And so I'd like to actually dig in and really get into the details, like what, because people say, the big question is, what's the difference between syntropic agriculture and alley cropping agroforestry systems, right? And
And
so,
the other question that people ask is,
yeah,
what's the difference between permaculture and syntropic? Which
yeah,
that's an interesting question too, because they're quite different in a way. Like
yeah,
syntropic farming is a sort of a strategy you can use within a broader permaculture design system. That's kind of how
yeah,
I explain it. I wonder whether
yeah.
you would have a response.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I'd be like, permaculture is a whole systems design science. So we're looking at housing, we're looking at energy systems, we're looking at water flow. Syntropic agriculture is looking at cropping systems,
Mhm.
right? And one of the interesting thing is that about, and I won't go into the weeds too much about this, but I talked a lot with the guy Sebastian who was on the video about row orientation. And in tropic agriculture, apparently, and again, this is just, I haven't taken a course or anything like that. Orientation to the sun trumps orientation to contour.
Yes, that's what
And
I've heard too.
so,
How did they respond? Because that worried me when I
yeah,
first heard that too.
yeah, we had a big discussion about that. And I mean, he was like, well, you could still do water harvesting structures. Even if you had a row going down slope, you could still use, say, like the half moon water harvesting structures for each tree. But that the system that they've worked out for production, they're basically doing lots of chop and drop, lots of soil production off of all of this woody biomass. They're like growing all these mulch plants, and then they're using that for the fertility of the rows, and they have it really down based on your solar aspect for like what they can sort of guarantee production. So they're like, put the rows on the sun and then retrofit water harvesting structures,
Mm.
basically. So
Got
I don't
layers.
know. Yeah, I'm like, I'd have to have a more in-depth, like, you'd have to look at an actual site and be like, let's look at this site, for example. And so they're like, you can put it on contour, but then it's not syntropic agriculture.
Yeah, so there's layers, and I think that's where we're weaving syntropic farming into a permaculture design approach is really important, because it gives you that larger picture and the water systems as well. Because I have seen quite a few that have just been just the sun, whereas we need to include all of those things. Yeah, yeah. There's a question in the Q&A about what role are the women playing in this restoration work that you've seen.
Yeah, and it's a shame that I am a male that shows up at these sites for a very short period of time. And when you go to a foreign country as a foreign male, the people that you meet and that get on camera are the men, basically. And like so many of the projects that I have documented, and this same goes for India big time, is like there are really important, strong women behind these projects. And, oftentimes they're not English speakers. I need to talk to the English speaker. And oftentimes, the protocols of a foreigner visiting a village, visiting a community, is you are welcomed by, the men who lead things. So, unfortunately, like because of that, I'm not able to paint as much of a picture of the importance of how important women are in these projects, and so that's just like it's kind of just what it is. And I recognize that, and I try to remedy that. But I would say that the women's groups, and through some of in this particular video, I really tried to throw a B-roll of that the WFP gave me of like the women meeting in the groups, to kind of like show how key women are to this design. But they have these participatory design processes, and the women are absolutely pivotal to those participatory processes.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that response. And it is the limitation, as you said, of showing up. And even if I showed up in those places, still there's the protocols of going through the cultural dynamics in place. So
Yeah, you may have to live somewhere for some
yeah.
period of time before like you get past the layer of men that you are, that it's appropriate for you to interact with.
What we're
Yeah.
doing at the moment with a lot of the communities across East Africa, and particularly in the refugee communities, is supporting the access to cameras and also knowledge.
There's another thing I just wanted to mention. I read an article today. The article was there's been a lot of like, okay, so in the US, there's all these protests with the anti-genocide protesters and everything like that. There's been these recent like public sort of gaffes by different officials speaking very candidly to groups that are now coming out. And so there was this really interesting conversation that was not supposed to, they didn't think it was going to be public, but what they were basically saying was like, we're losing control of the narrative. If we lose control of the narrative, then that could actually negatively impact, you know, our ability to wage war. Right. And it was this, I saw this article, and it like struck me with this type of work. It's like the narrative that the people who, I mean, really have a lot of like power, military and governmental power, like control of the narrative, the story. But like, I guess what it made me feel is the story is so powerful. The story is extremely powerful. And so I feel like this video and just kind of this type of work is like getting, because the story, when you put out a story like this, a positive story or story that kind of creates a vision, it's like people start having that story run in their head, and then they act on that story. They're like, oh, this is the story of the world. The story of the world is people are actually getting together. The United Nations is putting energy into this, people, communities are getting together and restoring their ecosystem, restoring their lands, restoring their communities,
Yeah.
so I guess that's just another perspective on like why did this video get the amount of viewership it did, and what are the effects? You're like, oh, it's just a story. And I'll tell you one effect from this video that I was told by the WFP. They said, oh, we actually had a reluctant donor, right? And we showed this video to one of our reluctant donors, and they said, oh, now I get it. And they then gave funds to this resilience work, and specifically earmarked for centropic agriculture.
Mm.
So a story actually has the power to move resources.
Yeah, it's incredibly powerful, the stories that you're telling. And while this one has multiple millions, many other of your stories are also hitting the millions mark as well, which is just phenomenal. So while you're still teaching permaculture, you seem to be shifting a lot more into this work of being out in the world, telling this new narrative. I wonder what other ways you've seen it land and have had a transformational effect in terms of opening up possibilities.
Done a lot of work with the Pani Foundation in India. I've done 6 different videos of I've spent a good amount of time visiting their projects, visiting their villages now, and I have had a number of people, organizations contact me from different places in the planet. One's in Bolivia, one's in Mexico, about actually wanting to do their own water cup competition, right? So, this idea of like, oh, a competition to see who can do the most water harvesting structures, who can do the most agroforestry projects, most restoration. So I think like that idea seeped out into people's consciousness that you could actually gamify restoration, and permaculture work. So I think that there's been some concepts that have just kind of gotten out there at this point, and I've also seen a lot of examples of how people have applied, just like from the Chinampas video from Mexico City. And like I've had a lot of people talk to me of just like all the different places that has spread, that one concept. Because some of it's just like, you're like, oh, right, lower the wet parts and build up the drier parts and create more edge. And then you have aquatic and terrestrial cultivation. You're like, a little light bulb go up, they're like, ding, a little light bulb goes off above your head when you get this basic concept. So some of it's just like putting out these concepts, and then I hear little things, but they also just sort of rumble out there, and
Yeah, you'll never know the impact really, because it just does get into people's consciousness. Yeah, I wanted to ask you as well, because the other film that we were thinking about screening today was one of the ones from India, actually, and it was a village that has been rehydrating its landscape, and not just the village, but the region, and looking at that collective process of rehydration. Now, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that, but at the same time, I wonder why or how we can be translating this more collective approach to places like America and Australia, where we're just so stuck in our individual properties and what we can do within our boundaries. Whereas why these are successful is because they're beyond that.
Yeah. Now, India, I mean, I love India. India is just such a wonderful place. And there is very deep in the people's, collective consciousness is the spirit of cooperation. Now, of course, I don't want to actually put India on too much of a pedestal. India has lots of its own problems. But in living memory, Mahatma Gandhi did the Salt March. Like in living memory, millions of people in India spun their own cloth, and like the British colonial plan crumbled there. Right. So, I mean, that is like, it's right there. And I can give a lot of really interesting examples of of ways that I've seen the collective power in India, and that's like probably take this whole time period. So I won't get into it too much, but that is there. That's one thing. Number two, their village boundaries are very old, right? All of their settlements have been there for a long, long time. And so the boundaries of the villages typically follow the boundaries of the watersheds. So you have the overlapping of ecological and governance, right? So when the village makes a decision, the decision is about the watershed because that's their boundary. So it's like where, I mean, here in the US, I mean, just the fact that we have this grid of property ownership that does not correspond to ecological boundaries, to watershed boundaries. That's actually what I call the fundamental flaw of Western civilization, is superimposing a non-gridded property ownership network over the natural landscape, right? So those are two things that India really has. And then the other thing is, I mean, well, there's a few other things. One, there is a very ancient legacy of water harvesting because it's a monsoonal climate. And in a lot of these places, Rajasthan, I mean, it's like 9 months of extreme heat and drought. I have another video. I'm still making videos from India. I got two more, but one of them is the driest part of Rajasthan, the Thar Desert, showing like, and I went to places where, they get like 2 rainfalls a year and the groundwater is saline. And so it's all about surface storage, maximizing surface catchment. So they have all of these old, and then the step wells. I mean, there's this ancient, beautiful ancient technology. So they have all of this really old legacy to work off of. They don't have to sort of make anything up. They're just like, oh, what did our ancestors do? We have encyclopedias worth of strategies that we can employ. So, and then, you get basically like desperate, add in desperation, add in starvation and wells drying up, and you get the right sort of spark of a person who basically, like a lot of the organizations I have visited there, Lakshman Singh and GVNML is the one that video is about. Another one that I'm still making this video about is called Gravis. And they say, we are a Gandhian-based organization, right? We follow the principles of Gandhi, lifting up the poor, collectivism, collective, volunteerism, collective work. And so that, like, it's very, in America, if you're like, we're creating a Gandhian based organization. So everybody out, okay, we're all gonna, we're gonna get all the neighbors out together. Like, just doesn't go over as well, Yeah. So there's just so many spectacular examples of that community, politics, and ecology and agriculture all overlapping like perfectly.
Yeah. And I think that, I even look at Australia and we're full of Indigenous countries, and each one of those overlaps with an ecological system. So traditional governance is ecological governance simultaneously. And I think we need to pay attention to that and really look at our governance structures, and also to expand our thinking when we're thinking permaculture projects, to look to how we can expand to a bioregional awareness, and not necessarily have bioregional organizations, but to create the connections and threads of possibility. And Daniel Christian Val was here earlier in the festival talking about this. So, there is a festival playlist. I'm just speaking to everyone who's here now. If you miss any of the topics, please go back and have a look at the playlist. It's going to be available there for you to dip into anytime you want. And also, just while we have a couple more minutes with Andrew here, if there are any questions, I'd love for you to drop them into the Q&A. Joanne just dropped one in. Thank you. Have you noticed adjacent people restarting these methods?
Yeah, that always happens. I mean, every project I've ever looked at, most people in my experience, people that are farmers, they're not like, they don't learn by you telling them. They learn by, oh, what's going on, by seeing. So in all of these projects, they do it, enough time goes by, and the neighbors start to go, you guys have water and we don't, right? Or your prosperity, they see prosperity, because that's what happens when you do these things. I mean, when you have water, when you're building soil, when you're diversifying your food sources, when your ecosystem's restoring, you end up having prosperity. So the prosperity becomes a really big motivator. And then all of these projects I've ever seen like this, whether it's the Pani Foundation or Lakshman Singh and Laporia, or even the projects in Senegal. There's the other video I'd made from Senegal is a wonderful project as well. Trees for the Future, which they've done 8,000 food forests. It's another incredible project. But all of these projects have an interest in having organic spread of the ideas. And so all of them are intentionally encouraging outreach and, neighbors teaching neighbors sort of thing. So yeah, they all spread, I would say.
And I really like the way that, in the film you were saying that this is like a field school. That place was where people come to learn, because they come in and they learn how to set them up and then how to take them back out to their place. I was
Yeah.
talking to Marina O'Connell earlier in the festival too. She's based at Huxham's Cross Farm, just down the road from Schumacher College, and she was talking similarly about how they've been rehydrating the landscape and restoring the soil, and that when there was a drought in England, I mean, it's not very common, but it's starting to happen, that everyone was looking across saying, how come you're green? Can I have some of your grass? And saying, well, actually, no. So this thing of looking across, so wherever you are, whatever place you've got, to be really sharing your story. So even if it's simple filmmaking or storytelling or sharing out, just let people see around you, but also share it further. You don't have to be a master filmmaker to be able to share out your story and help to shift the narrative.
And a non-media strategy would be just like at my place here. I have a school right down the street. I have like kids all the time walking up and down. So I have, edible foods planted all on the sidewalk, basically figs and cherries and plums and different types of berries and stuff. So just like I feel like that's outreach.
Yeah,
It's like changing the narrative. I feel like if every kid grew up knowing that there was just food lining the sidewalks and the roads, I mean, that's world peace right there.
Yes,
right?
exactly. There's a couple of questions that have dropped in. One was a follow-up question from Joanne, who asked the previous one, was really about, what about grazing? Do these areas need to be protected to stop the grazing animals coming in? How do they manage that? Because that was a big question that came up last night with they were having to put up fences to actually get this regeneration to happen. And just to
grazing and
sorry.
You think she's talking about the Senegal project?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so they did put up a fence. That was one of the big expenses of the WFP, but basically it comes down to agreements between farmers and pastoralists, because the pastoralists can actually control their herds, right? So they have some projects, WFP has some projects, hopefully I'll see in Niger, that are so big that there's no way you can fence them all. But they really have to work, on the community discussions and including all of the different stakeholders and making sure that that the stakeholders they include are the pastoralists, because the pastoralists actually, like, some projects, they've had armed guards there to keep people out while the plants were coming. One project, the pastoralists were not included initially, and they went and they cut the fence and they let their livestock in. And then the reaction from the community in the WFP was, oh, they brought them in, said, oh, they were actually upset that they hadn't been given some land themselves.
Yeah.
So it turned out that a lot of the solutions to that are communication based.
Always, isn't it?
Yeah.
And really involving everyone who needs to be involved. And the final question we've got here is, how are the seeds and trees grown and distributed? So, like a lot of that was talking about, I heard, indigenous local species of the sorghums and the millets, but also lots of fruit trees, and like where is all that coming from?
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. The syntropic agriculture people, because Brazil has a very similar, a lot of there's syntropic agriculture projects in very similar climate to the Sahel, and so they actually are importing certain varieties. And again, that's like very permaculture in a sense, like, oh, what are your best varieties? And so they're trying to get some really good opuntia, like prickly pear varieties going, because they don't really have those good ones in Senegal, and various fruit trees and such. And so the WFP is actually doing a lot of work to locate and then going through the sort of arduous process of importing species, because you have to go through different agricultural checks and that sort of thing. So that's happening. As far as distributing it, they don't have a nursery, because, and I was like, why don't you guys have a nursery? Like, because they don't have the skill set in that area to run a nursery. The WFP is not there all the time. I mean, they're so the goal, and I think of any project like this, is have a bioregional nursery. And I would assume that they would get there eventually. But right now they're still basically in the like collecting genetic material.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for joining me today here in the festival, and thank you everyone who's here and been asking questions and making comments. But I just want to thank you so much, Andrew, for everything that you do and sharing out these amazing films with the world, and really switching on those light bulbs, because it's when you see what's possible, you then it does shift the story, and it changes in your heart this sense of like, oh, yeah, like it's not there is devastation, but there's possibles to transform this, sometimes actually quite rapidly, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, things can change really quickly, especially if we decide to change in mass, it's incredible how fast things can change. And so keep tuning in. I'll keep showing you examples of massive change as I'm traveling and reporting them. Yeah, and thank you so
Fantastic.
much for having me. I really appreciate it. And
Yeah, thank you,
thanks,
Andrew.
thanks you
Take
all
care.
out there. Yeah.
See you
All right.
later. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Sense Making in a Changing World from the International Permaculture Festival of Ideas, and to where you can find all the conversations at the International Permaculture Festival of Ideas. Check out the show notes below to find the link to Andrew's YouTube and website, and to watch the film we screened together, and where you can actually find all the conversations that happened at the 2024 International Permaculture Festival of Ideas. And also check the show notes for where you can find details of our permaculture courses and resources. Make sure you're signed up to hear news and updates, and come and join us at the Permaculture Education Institute to learn practical skills for designing and teaching permaculture and making a good livelihood while living a permaculture-inspired, one planet way of life.